Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
GSMC Podcast Network. It is Wednesday, which means we're not talking about Hyperion, but it does, however, mean we are talking about something else, which would be the natural conclusion if I said we're not talking about Hyperion. Last Wednesday, I talked about the film A Scanner Darkly, and I mentioned that it was a short story by Phillip K. And I, this week, decided I was going to purchase that book. Did I say short story? It's a book. It's a novel. Like, it's its own novel. And decided I was going to purchase the book and do a couple weeks of podcasting on it because I loved the movie so much and the story. And I'm just always interested in seeing how people interpret things by Phillip K. He's a really interesting writing. He's a really interesting writer, or author rather. I feel like his stories, his novels, they lend themselves a lot more to film, just in general. But that doesn't mean that the books aren't still great. If you guys remember correctly, or if you remember perchance at all, a while back I did do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, and I really enjoyed that book, actually. And then I talked about it in comparison to the two Blade Runner movies from the last... Well, 2049 is from the last couple of years, and then the original Blade Runner is in the 80s. So it was a really fruitful conversation. I felt like there was a lot to say about both the books and the movies. So I figured I would do a quick couple weeks on A Scanner Darkly, the novel, and then probably do a comparison and contrast as well. So today we're going to start out with just the first 4 chapters of A Scanner Darkly. But I imagine that over the course of the next few weeks, because there's going to be a lot of parallels between the novel and the movie, I'll move a little bit more quickly through the book. And I will say, having seen the movie and now reading the book already, just in the first 4 chapters, there's enough difference, I think, to justify doing both in either order. The movie, I don't think, spoils anything too greatly for the book. If I was going to wager a guess in very similar fashion to Do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, I would guess that A Scanner Darkly is going to have a pretty different twist from the movie. Just like Do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, the twist was quite different. The movies were just absolutely just based off of the book, really. They were not a representation of the book, which is something that I feel like I should mention. There's a lot of movies that are based off of a book, and I feel like a lot of people are always like, oh, well, the book is better. And it's like, well, no, yes and no. The book is ultimately just different, in my opinion, in most cases. So, like, as a great example... Blade Runner. The ending of that with the monologue that we get for Teardrops in the Rain, like that's also in the book, almost verbatim, which it's just an amazing monologue. So it doesn't surprise me that they pretty much just lifted it straight out of the book. But because of that, not because of that, but in spite of that, there are a lot of other differences that really basically just make the movie kind of like, like we took the premise of the book and some of the loose narrative components of it and put it into a film because, like, in the end, gosh, why can't I remember the guy's name? I can't remember the main character's name now. Well, as you all know, I am terrible with names, so judgment is expected in some capacities in this particular case. But regardless, the movies, there is a little bit of like similar elements, of course, but it just feels like they kind of, the director, Ridley Scott, and the writers just kind of said like, well, this book is really, really freaking good, so we're gonna just write a movie based off of the premises of the book and then try to include some of the philosophies and themes from the book. Ultimately, books just have more time to hash out what it is that they're trying to get at, and authors usually, they don't have as much oversight on them as like a Hollywood production does, because Hollywood movies they're designed for a specific type of consumer to be consumed in a specific kind of way, and books they just generally reach a much more broad audience, so they don't necessarily have to be as niche. And I'm kind of using those two terms counterintuitively. Normally you would say books are niche and movies are broad because, movies are trying to appeal to more people. But what I mean is that, like, in regards to stylistically, there is a huge, there's just a plethora of different movie styles and directing styles, writing styles for films that can solicit all sorts of different outcomes. And the specific type of outcome that you're looking for when you make a blockbuster or a cult classic like Blade Runner is substantially different from what you would be looking to make if you're like a Wes Anderson type director. So in that sense, making a blockbuster is a niche, or making a commercially viable film is a very niche thing to do, whereas making something like a book that can kind of go anywhere is much more broad. So when they were making Blade Runner, Ridley Scott notoriously was given like a ton of notes and had a ton of oversight on him in regards to like what it was that he was actually even allowed to do for the film. That's why there's 3 different cuts. There's a theatrical cut, a director's cut, and the final cut. And the final cut is objectively the best one. A lot of people like the theatrical cut because there's narration, but Ridley Scott really hated the narration. And Harrison Ford doesn't exactly do a great job of it. Though I will say it does make some of the headier concepts of that film much more accessible, which is overall pretty great. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it's desirable when it comes to making a film that's got those like heady concepts of philosophic discourse, symbolism, allegory, all of those things. Like when you're trying to include all of that, if you have to narrate it and explain it to your audience, then like you may be trying to appeal to the wrong audience. But of course, this is where, books and movies kind of differ pretty drastically, especially in the oversight afforded to both of them. When you're making a movie, the budget's a lot larger, so you have to generally make it more accessible than a book because, books, you spend plenty of money on making the books and selling the books to places that are going to stock and then sell those books in turn. But it's vastly different from a movie that you spend millions of dollars on and then, distribute and cross your fingers that you're going to end up with enough money to recoup your losses. So all that to say, I think that reading a book and watching a film ought to be considered somewhat different experiences in a lot of cases. With stuff like Harry Potter, the movies are basically an abridged version of the book. It's not like they took the Harry Potter universe, made up characters, and then said, okay, now we're going to go from here. No, they literally were like trying to do the story of the books. And so those could possibly be compared, but again, they're just different experiences. Like some of us probably imagined Daniel Radcliffe looked exactly like Harry Potter, but there are probably a lot of other people who were like, that's not how I envisioned him, and that's, just part of making a movie and writing a book. I will, however, say, so Paul Giamatti is the one who's reading the A Scanner Darkly, the version that I'm listening to on Audible. Does an excellent job. And I'm curious as to when he recorded this, because him reading it out loud, he makes the character that Robert Downey Jr. plays in the movie, he makes that character sound just like Robert Downey Jr. And I don't know if it's kind of like a confirmation bias on my part or some other thing, but basically what I want to say is that Robert Downey Jr. is the perfect person to have played that part. I don't want to. Hank is the boss. So I think Frank is the guy that is Robert Downey Jr.'s character, or Charles. I can't remember, but Robert Downey Jr. was an amazing casting pick. Keanu Reeves was kind of middling. Woody Harrelson fits the bill. The guy who they had play Jerry was perfect for it. And then of course Diane doesn't have a ton of dialogue in the book as of yet, or in the film. Philip K. Dick, I think he kind of sticks to what he knows as far as characters are concerned, and mainly writes men, which is fine. I think that, of course, we can always wish that there was a little bit better representation in older books and things like that, and I don't disagree with hoping or wishing for that, especially in the future. But also, at the same time, I would rather see someone kind of stick to what they know and not start kind of sticking their foot in their mouth by trying to write about a human being that they don't understand necessarily. It's very few authors can effectively do that. So to get started, the book and the film pretty much start in the same way, but there's a lot more time and care put into the introduction. At the beginning of the film and at the beginning of the book, and this is the only time I'm going to mention this, at least in the podcast. From here on out, I'll be just talking about the book. We start out with the character Jerry, whose name we don't know yet, being covered in aphids. And in the film, there's not very much resolution for that character, but in the book, there's a lot of focus on him. So the entire first chapter is pretty much about Jerry and his experience with the bugs and driving to Bob Arctor's house, which is like kind of the first scene of the movie as well. But the book describes the bugs on Jerry as being present 24/7, filling his house so much that there's like a cloud of them. He's scared that they're getting in his lungs. He's scared that they're getting in his dog's lungs. Like, they're just absolutely, I don't know if I'd say absolutely terrifying, but there's in the book, it's like, okay, well, this is a factual thing that is happening right now. And so you're like, okay, what the heck? And then Philip K. Dick starts kind of talking about like, well, but other people don't see them. Doctors don't see them. And Jerry is starting to like spray Raid on himself and fumigate his house, and is spending like 8 hours in the shower. Like, he'll just sit in the shower all day to try to keep the bugs off. And then there's a little bit more of like a mythos that gets developed with the bugs, and I think it's kind of like Philip K. Dick's attempt to show different stages or levels of addiction, and the ways in which drugs affect people. As I've mentioned before, the end of the movie, there's a dedication by Philip K. Dick, for who the movie was about, and it basically, and I think he wrote the book to kind of talk about addiction, the way that the justice system handles addiction, and how we as a society view and perceive addiction, because a lot of Philip K. Dick's friends were affected by heroin addiction, because that was one of the biggest drugs that was present at the time in L.A. And Philip K. Dick does mention heroin and cocaine and other drugs that were big in the 80s. This book is based in the 90s, but it's a science fiction book because it's in the future, according to when it was written. And there's a lot of things in this book that are very future technology. So I think it's interesting. I actually haven't verified when the book was published, which I will definitely be doing, and then we'll kind of talk about, you know, whether or not this falls into like a predictive science fiction thing, which I think that it does in a lot of parts. But regardless, Jerry basically, you know, is trying to figure out what's going on with these bugs, wants to take them to a doctor so those bugs can get tested, and wants to figure out how to get rid of them because he believes that they're being sent by aliens or something, or there's like some force exterior to him acting on him because of the bugs and things like that. So we're going to finish talking about this right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
We were just kind of talking about the first chapter of Phillip K. Dick's novel, Scanner Darkly. I guess just in case you didn't listen to the episode that I did previously on the film, I should probably just like kind of do a brief little, I guess, overview of the plot of the book. You know, because if you didn't listen to the one about the film, then you have no idea what I'm talking about. So A Scanner Darkly is a book that was written, I just checked the publication date, not written. It was written in the 1970s, published in 1977. Apparently it's one of Phillip K. Dick's better known novels, which is kind of surprising because I had never heard of it until I had heard of the movie. But, I mean, I'm only 29, so I haven't exactly been around the block for too long, so there's a good chance that it is like his best known work and I just wasn't familiar. But the basic premise or plot of the book is we are following the story of a gentleman named Bob Arctor. Primarily, there's a lot of character switching throughout this novel, which has made it a little bit confusing. But it seems like most of the narrative is from the viewpoint of Bob Arctor. And so we're following Bob Arctor as he kind of goes through this journey of, I guess I should back up further. Let's just describe the world real quick, and then we'll describe the characters in the plot. So the world is Orange County in the 1990s, which is about 10 to 15 years after Phillip K. Dick would have been writing this story, I would wager to guess. And a drug by the name of Substance D has taken over the streets would be lack of another word, or would be the best way to phrase it. I'm not entirely sure. Substance D isn't ever really described as giving a specific type of high, but it is incredibly addictive and it's incredibly damaging to your brain. And what it basically does is kind of like shut down different portions of your brain as the longer you're on it, or it kind of like makes your brain operate in ways that are not, I guess, natural. So, like your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere might not work in the way that you're hoping, or in the way that you would traditionally expect them to be working. Certain, like your visual centers will start to collapse or do weird things. Your ability to think, to remember, everything. So basically, Substance D is this highly addictive drug that doesn't really seem to do much for anybody who's taking it, but it does a lot for the people who aren't taking it. And or it does a lot really for the people who are selling it, because it is so addictive that you can't really not, like, once you're on it, you are just on it. It's kind of like the way that it's described is like as an absolute, like you either are on substance D or you are not on substance D. And if you are on substance D, you're a junkie, you're a dropper or something like that. A doper, thank you. Thank you, Keith. You're a doper. And if you're not, then you're part of this group called the Cleans, which is it's funny that there's this like dichotomy that Phillip K. Dick makes a point of mentioning that exists between people who are taking the drug and people who are not taking the drug. And it's so pervasive in the culture that there are actually there's categories and ways by which people are segmented into specific groups. Like you are, it's almost like a hierarchy in some capacity. And then in addition to that, the people who are not on the drug, the cleans, they live in like entirely different living situations from the people who are on the drug. So I wouldn't be surprised if like a lot of this novel ultimately is also commenting on the way in which drugs disproportionately affect the poor, or that maybe the drugs are the cause of poverty in some capacity. This is a book that was written in the 70s, so there would be not as much understanding of the psychological implications of an individual, or not as much understanding regarding the psychological implications of addiction within individuals and the proclivities that individuals have towards addiction based off of the miscellaneous factors that are contributed to by income and living situation. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Phillip K. Dick basically say that rich people are using drugs to keep poor people poor in some way, which I don't think would be a terribly inaccurate assessment. Though I will say it kind of seems more like substance D is kind of supposed to represent a specific type of capitalism, if I had to guess, for Phillip K. Dick, because it kind of is this thing that you either participate in or you don't. And if you're not participating in it, then like it's still affecting you pretty dramatically, but not negatively. And so like it creates this artificial hierarchy of value for individuals in a similar fashion to how capitalism might work, in my opinion. So I definitely think that is going to be explored throughout this novel. But there's specific mention of the fact that like the people who are not on substance D live in like gated communities or fancy apartment complexes that have security guards that keep junkies and dealers out, whereas people who are living in not as nice of situations don't have any protection from substance D. And Bob Arctor actually makes mention, and several characters make mention in the first 4 chapters, of the fact that there are individuals going around who are attacking people and getting them hooked to substance D as a method of creating more clients for themselves. So in a weird way, this drug, well, not in a weird way, in a way, this drug is so addictive that it is being weaponized to create income. And if I don't know if I'm not going to give away the twist that was at the end of the movie. I have a feeling the twist will be similar at the end of the book, or the twist will happen somewhere within the book, and we'll get a little bit more about that than we did in the film. But regardless, there is a scene where Bob Arctor is required to give a speech in front of the Lions Club, and this is the first time I think that we interact with Bob Arctor. We get introductions to Charles Frick, who is kind of like this. I don't know. I want to say like magnanimous. He's perceived as being magnanimous at first character, and then there's Frank, and then there's Jerry, and those are the 3 kind of druggies that Bob Arctor hangs out with. So they're kind of like his crew. But Bob Arctor is also an undercover police officer, And the way that the undercover police officers work in this particular universe for Philip K. Dick's purposes is that their identity is unknown by anybody within their precinct or within their office, because there is this belief and this paranoia that the people who are manufacturing substance D, the people who are the initial point of manufacturing, have, I guess, manipulated their way into every aspect of law enforcement. And so they're kind of basically avoiding being, caught and incarcerated by kind of, I guess, I don't know, like sabotaging, or there's a specific word that I can't think of that I'm stalling so that I'll think of it, but I don't think I'm going to think of it. But basically they have like plants, they have moles, they have all sorts of people who are involved in law enforcement to keep them from having their manufacturing means be discovered, or have the person who's really kind of running the whole operation be discovered. And that is why Bob Arctor, who is our main character, wears I guess it's a skin, it's not a skin suit. It's like a suit that projects an infinite number of combinations of a person onto the external portion of it. And it's basically it's described as being seen as a vague blur, so as to completely obscure the identity of the wearer. And then it also has a voice, like, converter, I guess would be the best way to phrase it, so that there's no way that vocal recognition could be possible either. And that includes, like, it eliminates inflection and everything like that. So it makes everything sound incredibly monotoned, so that, like, if someone were to mention something in an interview or mention something in passing, you're not going to be able to tell whether or not a person was being emotional underneath their suit. And so everybody wears those suits who works in the precinct in order to obscure or obfuscate, just to sound fancy, obfuscate their identity, so that they can continue to work undercover and not be discovered by any potential like agents or secret saboteurs within the undercover police agency, I guess, for lack of another word. So we meet Bob Arctor as he's addressing a crowd of people who are not druggies, and he basically just kind of tells them he's given a speech, he is given a speech to say to them, which he ends up departing from because he kind of has like this weird like space out moment where it's just like, oh, I totally forgot what it is that I'm supposed to say, and he starts talking about how like incredibly awful substance D stands for death, desertion, things like that. And he basically starts talking about how the community has been affected by substance D, because he feels like the people who are in this meeting don't really have any idea of what substance D actually does or is, because they just don't take it, and they never have and probably never will. So he has to try to convince them that, like, it's not this simple dichotomy of like, okay, junkies are bad and you guys are good. It's a more complex dichotomy of the suppliers of the junkies are bad. The junkies are just dumb junkies, is kind of what he's trying to say. It's like, look, if you were a diabetic and you needed insulin, but you had no money, would you steal the money to buy the insulin, or would you steal the insulin? And so for him, what he's kind of trying to say is like, substance D is so addictive that you you start to believe that it is intrinsic to your survival. And so the actions of junkies are somewhat justified in their moral, the realm of what is moral behavior for them, because to them they believe that they will die without substance D, because it's just that addictive and it does what it does to your brain if you're on it. And Bob Arctor is kind of talking about that because he is someone who has become hooked on substance D, because as part of his undercover work, he, hangs out with junkies who are always taking it. And so if he were to not take it, it would become very clear that he didn't belong. And so he has to take it. he probably could fake taking it, but I'm not entirely sure if that is within his realm of like desire. He might actually kind of want to take it along with the people who are taking it as well. But all that to say, this is our first mention that we get of the fact that there are dealers who are actively, like, they go out and attack young women, especially because young women are easier to subdue for them. They'll go out and attack young women and inject them with substance D to get them hooked so that they'll start being able to push the product onto them so that they can kind of increase their client base. It's a weaponized version of the first hit is free. So that kind of gives us like a more grand scope of what it is that this world looks like. And why I would say that in some capacities, Substance D is a representation or is a commentary on capitalism and not just on like the ideas of addiction. Because one of the things that capitalism does is trick you into thinking that you have to live by it in order to survive. And that's not totally untrue because, you are kind of bound within the economic systems that you are born into if you want to experience the things of your past, which you have a nostalgia for. It's a self-serving cycle, really, that I don't necessarily agree or disagree with. I'm just saying, this might be Phillip K. Dick's interpretation of it. So we're going to keep talking a little bit more about like the different themes in this book, as well as some more story summary of these first 4 chapters, and that'll be right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Novel Scanner Darkly. Right before the break, I was kind of mentioning, some of the things that Phillip K. Dick might be commenting on with the themes and characters, and some of the subtle nuances to this particular work by him. There is a substantial amount of commentary happening in this book. At least I feel that there is. I think that one of the biggest things that Phillip K. Dick is trying to accomplish is to get us in the head of somebody who is addicted to a substance that they feel like they don't have any control over, or is so they don't feel like they have any control over their addiction would be the better way to phrase it. So they're so addicted to a substance that they feel as if they've lost control over themselves, they've lost control over their craving for that substance, they've lost control just in general. And the film does this really well. So far the book is doing a pretty good job of like really giving you empathetic and interesting characters, at least as far as Bob Arctor and Jerry are concerned. Jerry is a very empathetic character because you almost feel this like weird sense of pity for him. Even in the first 4 chapters, he eventually gets turned into New Haven, which is the drug rehabilitation clinic that is kind of like the best known for helping people get off of Substance D. And the big thing about Substance D is that once you're hooked, when you get off of it, the damage that has been done can either be like exacerbated or mitigate or like permanent. So you might regain some of your faculties by the end of the whole experience of getting off of substance D, but the likelihood of that happening is really slim. So it's just kind of generally a very, I guess, malicious industry. And also in the first 4 chapters, we find out that Bob Arctor, who is our main character, who is known as Frank at the precinct, we find out that Bob Arctor is under suspicion for being like a very large dealer of substance D. And the thing about substance D, or the way that the distribution model of it, is that essentially there is one primary supplier or manufacturer rather, for everybody. At least this is kind of what they've concluded. There's one primary manufacturer who manufactures and sends substance D out to pretty much everybody. And then it gets distributed down into more local systems as it goes. But in order to get to the person who's manufacturing it at the top, you kind of have to infiltrate your way into, I guess, the industry, for lack of another word. Because it just seems like there's an infinite number of rabbit holes. So what Bob Arctor is trying to accomplish at all times is to basically acquire so much substance D that he's able to work his way up into needing to purchase from more, or sources that are more and more closely tied to the initial source, the direct source. So that is kind of his goal with, especially his interactions with Donna, because he believes, Donna is one of his suppliers. He also is interested in her as a human being, romantically. And so when Diane. When we first meet Diane, it's, she interacts with Jerry, and Jerry asks to buy from her. And she seems hesitant, but eventually caves. And then after that, Bob Arctor interacts with her, asking for a larger order than what Jerry had asked for, hoping that he's going to make it so that Diane can no longer front the money to her supplier to get the quantities that he's asking for. Because he pays on time because the state is essentially paying for the substance D. So he pays on time and is able to acquire substance D from her in a fairly large quantity. But what he wants to do is basically make it so that she can no longer front the money to the guy above her, because he takes cash up front, whereas she'll basically order and then have the product ready when the person is going to exchange. So it's not like they give her cash and then she gives them product a few days later. She has to front the money for the product and then sell it to somebody else a little bit later down the line. So that's kind of the way that most of the undercover cops work, is that's what they're trying to accomplish, is move up the line by subtly ordering larger and larger quantities until someone is suspicious that they're dealing or what have you. But they have to do so in a way that makes it look like they're trying to not get caught, because if they were caught, then they would be fine because they're really undercover cops. But the problem is that, if you do things too obviously, then people will wonder how it is that you don't get caught. They'll be suspicious, and they might not want to sell to you in the quantities that you're looking for. Should be a problem, because that in turn prevents you from being able to, move up through the ranks and figure out who it is that's doing the supplying. But what's interesting in part about the economy of substance D is that the manufacturer that creates it, because they hold a monopoly on it, they set the price for it. And rather than making it like super expensive, they basically make it into an opiate of the masses. Like, they reference heroin in this a few times, but I really think that substance D is kind of like a physical manifestation of Karl Marx ideas about opiates for the masses. He said it was religion. In Philip K. Dick's particular iteration, he's saying that substance D is the opiate of the masses, because he's consistently comparing it, or consistently bringing it up in juxtaposition to heroin and cocaine, two other highly addictive substances that are usually associated with being more expensive habits. Substance D, however, is sold at dirt cheap. So you can get a tab, quote unquote, a pill, whatever you want to call it, for less than $1 a piece. So when you go to order 300 tabs of Substance D, you might end up paying only like $200 and some odd for it, which is, that's like a week's supply of Substance D for most like addicts, I would guess. So they haven't really referenced how much an addict goes through in a week. But let's assume that it's a week's supply and you're only paying $200 for it. Like, that's a lot less than you would pay for things like cocaine, which they specifically mention in the book as being much more expensive and difficult to obtain. And I think that like kind of making it cheap and easily accessible, because it's such an addictive drug and people don't get off of it frequently. And when they do, they usually don't recover. Like it seems to me like to be a fairly successful business model for whoever is manufacturing Substance D. Because in the book versus in the movie, the Substance D comes from a flower, and it's a derivative of an opiate flower, which is why I'm partially comparing it so much to heroin, because heroin is an opiate derivative. But in the book, it's said to be completely synthetic. So that means it's like comes completely out of a lab. And so I think that it's important to take note of the fact that Philip K. Dick is kind of saying, like, look, if you weaponize an economic system in order to ensure that your clientele is hooked to your product, then it becomes much easier for you to manipulate your clientele into, behaving in the fashion or the way in which you desire for them to behave. And it's pretty evident to me that, like, one of the more pernicious things of Substance D is the economy surrounding it. Philip K. Dick, like I had mentioned earlier, they're called pushers, and pushers will intentionally get people hooked to Substance D. There's a story that Hank, the supervisor of Bob Arctor, is telling about how there was a young woman who is assaulted by her brothers and then forcibly given Substance D. She becomes addicted, and then in order to pay for the habit, they decide to pimp her out. And so the economy of Substance D in itself is so addictive that it kind of turns people against each other in a way that is really just kind of sick and twisted, and just, counterintuitive to everything that would solicit success for individuals within a certain society, especially if you're looking at, like, what would be considered to be, like, a normal baseline of behavior. This is pretty far out there. And when Bob Arctor is giving his speech about Substance D in the community, he specifically says that, like, the pushers are the big problem because they get people addicted to this stuff. They force them to get addicted to it because they will weaponize it. And I think that, of course, that's Philip K. Dick saying, like, it's not necessarily the fault of the addict. Not that the addict is exempt from blame in any case or in any regard, but it's the fault of the person who's providing the product, because that person is preying on an individual who has a problem. And it's very obvious that that person has a problem. They either feel alienated or unable to function in their own body or what have you. They're like, towards the end of chapter 4, they start talking about Jerry again, because Jerry's turned himself into New Haven, apparently, or someone else turned him in because of his delusions about the bugs. Bob Arctor tries to think about, like, what it would be like to have met Jerry before Jerry had become a strung out junkie. And he thought, I can't even imagine Jerry operating at 100% because it's just so far off from what I know him, or how I know him to act. And so I think that part of what Bob Arctor is saying when he's talking about how, like, the pushers are the biggest problem is that there's a lot of people who have this, like, great wealth of potential and cognitive ability, who ultimately just end up kind of being ineffective and useless in the real world because they get hooked on this substance because there was some sort of disconnect in their brain or some sort of thing that occurred to them at some point in their lives that made it difficult for them to, interact with the world in a way that would be considered to be advantageous. And this kind of matches up with a lot of more modern takes on the idea of addiction, where addiction is not necessarily to a substance, but to the way a substance makes an individual feel, because that particular feeling assuages some sort of trauma or difficulty that person has with everyday life. A good example of this, if you want to get scientific, the receptors that cocaine and heroin slot themselves into are in the dopamine serotonin system. Dopamine and serotonin are reward-based systems inside of our brain where, specific, I guess they'd be called molecules or hormones or pheromones, or I can't remember exactly what they are specifically, but dopamine has slots in your nervous system where it's supposed to slide in, and these drugs imitate those things. So substance D kind of imitates a little bit of everything in some capacity. So it is playing very heavily on this reward system without actually giving you a reward. And I don't know, Phillip K. Dick seems to be a pretty knowledgeable individual. I wouldn't be surprised if he had a fair amount of knowledge about how it was that drugs interacted with the brain. But it seems fitting that something called substance D, which is basically stands for death, right? Sometimes they call it death pills or substance death, is ultimately this very nihilistic thing where it's going to fulfill all of these needs but provide you with nothing in return. And really, you can't really call it nihilistic because there is, you have to sacrifice things in order to obtain it, and by sacrificing things, that means things are there before. It's just ultimately kind of like a cyclical, unfulfilling thing. I don't want to call it Sisyphean because it's not quite that, because there doesn't really seem to be a reward, and if you fall in love with taking substance D, then you just die faster. So I'm not exactly sure how I want to tackle that. But we're going to take one more quick commercial break here before we finish talking about these first 4 chapters. There's a couple cool more things that I wanted to mention. We'll be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
We have been talking about A Scanner Darkly, which is a novel by Phillip K. Dick that I watched a movie on last week, so not that you needed the recap. Before the break, I was kind of wrapping up how it is that Phillip K. Dick kind of portrays different themes and different commentaries in the novel and what's important, what's not. And so there's a couple lines specifically that I really wanted to kind of say for the end of the podcast because I think they solicit the most discussion. And those instances both kind of occur around Bob Arctor's character. The first one is in I want to say the second chapter or the third chapter when we finally get introduced to Bob Arctor, and he's giving his predetermined speech or pre-written speech about substance D and its effect on the community. And he gets to 3 or 4 sentences in out of maybe 20, forgets and starts kind of going off on a tangent, and then a superior officer who was monitoring him just to make sure that he was kind of staying on on topic and things like that, comes in over the radio and says, hey, you need to stick to the script. Here, I'll read it to you. And he reads it, and Arctur starts thinking, like, this script, this is how people get hooked on Substance D. Because the script is just this, like, super boring, very watered down, unappealing, generally not that great script about, like, nothing. Ultimately, the script doesn't have anything, like, there's nothing meaningful being said in the script about anything. It's just kind of like empty platitudes and pithy sayings that sound like semi-inspirational to the audience. And for Bob Arctur, he says this is why people get hooked on Substance D. And then he realizes, well, no, this is why certain people get hooked on Substance D. These people who aren't doing this drug and who are sitting in this meeting, who think of themselves as being so much better than, like, these drug addicts, ultimately are, like, vapid shells of human beings. He kind of draws this conclusion that these people are just as mindless as somebody who's been on Substance D for years. And so I think that in part what Phillip K. Dick is trying to say here is something similar to, like, what Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or some of the other existentialist philosophers who believed that there are individuals who possess a certain kind of intellect have a proclivity for addiction to substances because everyday interactions are just so intrinsically empty to them because they kind of, I don't want to say they're woke necessarily to the realities of the world in a way that's more meaningful than the way in which somebody else might be, quote-unquote, woke to the realities of the world. But I think Phillip K. Dick's point overall here is that individuals who are searching for meaning, who possess knowledge of a certain sort, who have an inclination towards a very specific type of intellectualism, are very inclined to addiction because the world around them just ultimately is not satisfying. And it's not that it's not satisfying because of any fault of that own person's, of that individual. It's that it's just not satisfying to them on kind of like a core level because it doesn't provide the, like, meaning and satisfaction that they're looking for out of their interactions with the world in general. And so Bob Arctur he kind of falls into that category of someone who has this specific type of awareness, this daily existential crisis of, like, well, there has to be more to life than this, than these, like, pre-written speeches that ultimately don't say anything. There has to be more to life than this. And that causes a great deal of frustration for him. And he feels that would cause a great deal of frustration for most people, because, you know, we as human beings assume, like, well, this is the way we experience the world, so it must be the way that most people experience the world. And he has to kind of come to this realization that, you know, like, not everybody is interacting with the world in the way that he is. It's kind of this play on the idea of, like, ignorance is bliss in some capacity. Phillip K. Dick seems to like that theme a lot. Phillip K. Dick also seems to like the theme of taking care of animals a lot. I would guess he has a very strong sense of, like, duty and utilitarian pragmatism. But I think that that's kind of, like, one of the main points here. And this is kind of mentioned again later on when Bob Arctur starts to talk about his life prior to the work that he did, or the work that he does currently. So he, towards the end of chapter 4, starts to think about, like, okay, well, you know, how did I end up here? How did I end up doing undercover work? Because it sucks. Like, now I'm a suspect and I have to monitor myself and report on myself like I could get arrested. And it's all because, like, one of the people who I counted as, like, a confidant or friend is reporting me, and now I have to be paranoid about that. And so there's just paranoia is generally a theme throughout the novel, as it was in the movie. And so I am interested to see how that kind of plays out. I do really enjoy this idea of, like, a consciousness of things around you being not the way that they're supposed to be, but, like, just kind of struggling with how to reconcile that with your perception of reality. And things along those lines. If I had to guess, it'll, the paranoia will both be correct and incorrect in a myriad of different ways. So that will kind of play itself out. But the bigger thing that I want to mention here is that, there's two big factors that I think are going to be some primary themes moving throughout the novel. The first of which is that Arctur says that he was in his house one day, and all of a sudden, like he hit his head on something, and all of a sudden he realized that he hated his family, he hated his house, and he hated his kids even. He hated his life. And I think that that's kind of what he's trying to imply, like, and what Phillip K. Dick is trying to imply, like, this is what solicits, or this is what causes addiction. The cause of addiction is a lack of satisfaction with the world around you. And the way in which Phillip K. Dick kind of describes the things that Arctur hates is kind of like, it is absolutely just, it's straight up commentary on the things that we as a society have decided to place value in. So like, Arctur says he hates his suburban house that looks like all of the other houses on the street. He says that he hates his powered lawnmower. He hates that he has a wife. He hates that he has kids. And like, in a way, kind of what that says to me, which is odd, that this is odd for Phillip K. Dick to say, he said it's basically saying he hates that he has obligations. He hates that he has an obligation. Well, he hates he has an obligation to specific things. So I think that what he's trying to communicate is that he hates his obligation to mow the lawn, because it implies that he cares about what other people on the street think of his lawn, or what the appearance of his lawn it looks like. He hates his house. He's supposed to have a house. It's a commentary on, like, this is kind of the American dream, and ultimately it's not satisfying in any capacity. So where do I go now is kind of one of the conclusions that you could draw from this. Hates his wife, hates his kids, and realizes all of this kind of like in one whirlwind moment, and decides that he's going to have to, like, he has to make a change to the way that he's living his life if he's going to find any satisfaction in living at all. And I think that that's kind of generally what Substance D does, is it just makes you it gives you that ignorance that you would feel other people have. So, Phillip K. Dick, as an author, very critical of the world around him. A lot of people who are critical of the world around them, they kind of exist in this like somber or morose mood, just like frequently, if not like constantly. And I think that a big reason for that is that if you're aware of all the things going on around you at most of the time, then ultimately you're just really like, it's just a lack of satisfaction in those types of things, especially when you look at what we value in the American dream, like home ownership, wife, kids. Like, those things on a surface level aren't necessarily fulfilling. Fulfillment comes from within. And as long as we're focusing on all the material aspects of the things external to us and the way in which we appear to others, we're going to kind of end up like wanting for more. And Substance D stops that want. If I had to guess what it is that Substance D does, is that it makes you just not want for anything. It kind of just like satisfies and makes you feel like you're just okay. Which can, you can achieve through psychological work, but it just kind of seems like this is like a synthetic way to do that. And Phillip K. Dick makes mention specifically that, like, a lot of science fiction writers, they talk about whether or not, or they talk about drugs that will make people feel specific feelings so that they can kind of mitigate their lack of feeling in other places. So, or kind of counteract their abundance of feeling certain things. And so that's present in this novel as well. Phillip K. Dick talks about how if you go to like a medical place to get off of Substance D, they'll prescribe you medicines to help you get off of the drug, whereas New Haven does not do that. So just kind of like a difference in, like, or just a general statement of like, this is how we get somewhere valuable versus how we kind of just perpetuate things. And this is the type of hard work that it takes to find satisfaction in your life outside of the easy way out, which seems to generally be considered to be just taking Substance D and being high all the time. And then, as we're kind of closing out here, there was one quick thing that I wanted to mention. So I think that a big reason why I would consider this to be a science fiction book, even though it's based in the 90s, is that because when Phillip K. Dick was writing it, it was 20 years in the future, and a lot of it feels very predictive based off of trends that were happening concurrent with his authorship of the book, if I had to guess. You know, you were just coming out of the 60s, which had a lot of pro-drug culture. I know that Phillip K. Dick, like I said, wrote a dedication in the back of the book or in the front of the book that basically says, like, this is for all of my friends who suffered at the hands of highly addictive drugs. And it's kind of like a statement about, you know, like, this is what drugs do to you, this is why people get on them, this is what happens when you're on them, and things like that. So there's a specific mention that kind of makes me feel like this is very predictive science fiction of McDonald's. And he talks about how, and this is very Thomas Pynchon of him, or really Thomas Pynchon was copying Phillip K. Dick in this capacity. How McDonald's sells the same burger to the same person over and over and over and over and over again ad infinitum. Or ad infinity, I guess, I don't know. And Bob Archer is hypothesizing that eventually everybody will sell the same McDonald's burger to everybody else, and that exchange will ultimately be, like, empty. And I think that is, like, supposed to be a metaphor, an allegory, and a predictive thing all wrapped up into one little instance or one little mention, because if you're looking at human interaction in the way that Phillip K. Dick is kind of portraying it, it's like we ultimately end up saying a lot of the same things to each other, a lot of the same pithy platitudes, people are constantly repeating themselves, and that doesn't solicit, like, real connection with other human beings. And we're also kind of, like, purchasing things that are being marketed as being a unique and interesting experience, but they're really at a base level this, like, very bland, boring, same thing over and over and over again. It's kind of like when people will ask, like, is a hot dog a sandwich? Like, it's kind of like, well, how basic are we going to get with the definition of things? So if we're getting basic with the definition of things, which Phillip K. Dick, I think, is kind of trying to do, then ultimately a lot of the things that we purchase kind of boil down to the feelings we get from purchasing them. And so those feelings are like nostalgia or satisfaction or status, feelings of, like, high status and things like that. And ultimately that's what you're trying to solicit every time you purchase anything. So if you're just purchasing the same thing over and over again, which is a status symbol, or you're purchasing a, like, you know, an experience of eating this burger from McDonald's, then you're just buying the same thing over and over and over again. And that leads to an unsatisfying life. So that's all I've got for you guys this week in regards to this particular book. We'll be back on Sunday to talk about Hyperion some more. We are getting towards the end of that book. And then we will be talking about this book again next week as well. So definitely check all that stuff out. I do a lot of book reviews on this podcast because science fiction in general, there's a lot of cool stuff that happens, but I think a lot of the more interesting things happen in the books and things like that are published for science fiction. So I talk about the books. And if you listen to the podcast and haven't read the book, I think it's just as valuable as listening to the podcast after having read the book. So I would just encourage you guys to stay tuned and stay safe out there. If you like the podcast, give it a like, subscribe, give us a 5-star review. Check us out on social media, GSMC SciFi Podcast. Check out the other GSMC podcast offerings as well. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you guys have a safe week. Make sure you wear your masks outside. It shouldn't be a political stance to say wear your masks outside, but just want to make sure you know it's a non-political stance of saying wear your masks outside. It's just generally safer for the people around you. So make sure you're staying safe out there, and we'll see you guys next week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.